Hello and welcome to the Saturday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box. Where today I want to talk about quite a few things. It's been a weird and wild and pretty lame beginning to 2025, but hey, the January we get, we deserve, as Greg Lake might have said if he were in less of a Christmassy sort of mind. Well, as many, if not most of you around the world know, areas in and around LA are on fire. And it's a much worse fire than usual because of its size, because of its scope, and because it seems that a lot of arsonists are now setting their own fires for devious purposes. So we hope everyone over there is as good as they can be, even though most people are not doing very good, as one could expect. But this got me thinking a lot about how music and natural disasters relate because music is an emotional and cathartic experience. And music is something that has been used as a source not only of emotional catharsis, but of emotional information and indeed of factual and logical information over the years. So I want to talk about some of the things that relate to all of those things that have been sort of swirling around my head since this whole disaster started to happen. Now, the first thing I thought of is how lucky we are to live in an age of the cloud. And I don't mean the clouds that would ideally produce rain to maybe put some of those fires out, though that would be nice, but I mean the cloud as in the digital cloud, cloud computing, because before that invention, we were really at the mercy of physical formats and their duplicates. So, in other words, if you wanted to see what a composer wrote, you would need the manuscript or a copy of the manuscript. If you wanted to hear an original recording, you would need a physical tape, disc, or some other delivery mechanism to actually play it back. Now, in the analog world, every time you copy a recording, there is a degradation in the sound quality. That's why mastering a disc or duplicating a tape from the original master tape has always been considered the pinnacle of the listening experience. MoFi, which I talk about a lot on this channel, their whole marketing scheme from the very beginning was original master recording, meaning that the album that you have in your hand was made directly from the original master tape, not a duplicate. Because it's true that when we're talking about a second generation tape that's sort of been done very carefully in the original studio with the original engineers present, you could argue that it sounds indistinguishable from the original to the ear of most people. But once you get further down the line in the analog realm, you would be surprised at just how much the sonic quality degrades. Now, when we're in the digital realm, a lot of these problems are solved. You can make a one for one digital copy, and so long as the bit rate and the sampling, the bit size and the sampling rate are the same, pardon me, from the original to the copy, then you are not going to lose any sound quality. And this was, in fact, one of the major selling points for digital sound when it first came out. It doesn't degrade over time. A CD, in theory, and mostly in practice, sounds the same when you listen to it for the millionth time as when you took it out of the shrink wrap and put it in for the first time. And the same is true with virtually all digital formats. Of course, though, if all of those digital formats, hypothetically, were to all disappear because of combustion or flooding or alien invasion or something, then you're just as screwed as you would be if you lost the analog master tape. And if you want to take that analogy further, all of the other duplicates thereof. Now, this is where the cloud revolution to me is so important because obviously the cloud is in the digital realm. And so, whether you're cloning a digital copy or copying an analog tape and converting it to digital at the highest possible sound quality, think things like, 32-bit with a sampling rate of over 300. Think of, super high resolution DSD. When you copy an analog master at that level of quality, quality in terms of the digital duplication, you are relatively safe in knowing that listening back to it, it is going to sound pretty much identical to the original analog master tape. Some will disagree, and yet, of course, it's always better to hear a story from the horse's mouth. Nothing beats sitting in a wonderful studio with wonderful analog equipment and hearing that master tape played back. But since we do need backups, I think that these super high quality digital formats that we have today and that we've had for a number of years now, I think it really helps us all to sort of breathe a sigh of relief, because whatever might happen to that elusive analog master tape, we at least have it within us to, while we're in the room with that tape, to duplicate it on a digital format that we can then send up to a cloud. And from there, the preservation of the sound is disconnected from any single physical space. Now, that's not to say that clouds can't be hacked or otherwise destroyed, but in general, having it in a cloud infrastructure gives you a much better insurance policy than having it in several physical places. That being said, if you really want to do things right, not only will you have it in a secure cloud, but you'll duplicate it on several hard physical digital formats, as well as some fail-safe analog formats. And then you'll take that original master tape, put it somewhere near a salt mine, and just hope that there's no sort of Fifth World War or whatever. And about, I think it was about 10 years ago, there was actually a major fire, again in LA, at the back lot of the Universal Studios up in Universal City. And the reason that that had an impact on the music industry is because Universal Music stored a lot of their master tapes in one of the buildings that caught fire. Now, to this day, there's still not really any definitive information about just which tapes survived and which ones didn't. There have been a lot of lawsuits over this very subject, and there's been contradictory evidence, at least from my perspective, as to what was what. But again, this is why I would encourage all music studios, all artists that are in the physical possession of their own masters, get it into an environment where you can put it on a top class tape recorder and duplicate it to one of those, I would say, several digital formats. Because once you're putting it into the digital realm, there's nothing preventing you from saving it as several different digital formats all at once. So put it in high quality DSD, put it in high quality PCM, and while you're at it, make a few tape duplicates, label them very carefully while you're at it, because you never know when it comes to a physical possession, when disaster might strike. And frankly, I would encourage people um, to get a high quality camera, take photos, digital photos of all of their personal possessions, whether it's a handmade drawing, whether it's a physical photo that you no longer have the negatives to, whether it's a piece of artwork, whether it's a piece of machinery that you've grown fond of for its design aspects. Take a high quality digital photo and upload it to the cloud, because you never know. You never know when men or nature might come after your possessions. And I think that this is something, I mean, it's a bit like Smokey the Bear. You always have to take things like fire safety very seriously. A lot of allegations swirling around that the governor of California and the mayor of LA did not do so. But you, in your own life, can at least take some measures to digitally preserve the things that you would want to save in a disaster. And of course, there are plenty of very good fire safety courses on YouTube and elsewhere online that can tell you sort of what you need to do to help to protect your home, what kind of fire extinguishers and how many you should have. Things like fire blankets are good for sort of localized incidents like kitchen fires. And so it's never a bad time to learn about fire safety. And sometimes horrible things like the stuff that we're watching helps to remind us of that very fact. I've seen some videos of musicians who live in LA, because even though the world of the arts, thanks to the internet and the digital realm, is now geographically more spread out than it's ever been before, LA remains, albeit in a battered state, the home of the entertainment industry, which includes music. I was watching one channel. I apologize for getting the gentleman's name, where he was, de-racking all of his synthesizers and putting them somewhere where, in the event that he had to evacuate, he could put them in a van relatively quickly, because a lot of these older ones from the 60s, 70s, 80s, you can't get the originals anymore. They're not made anymore. And so that is definitely something where, in an incident of evacuation, you would definitely want to save things like that. And so I would just, yeah, advise all of the people living around there who are in the music industry to, I don't know, if you can, maybe rent a van if you don't have a car that's big enough for all your musical instruments, because a musical instrument itself cannot be uploaded to the cloud, as it were. You can MIDI the digital stuff in, but if you've got a big Hammond organ, um, try to get it out of town, I guess, if it's the safe thing to do. And that sort of brings me to another thing, a happier thing that I want to talk about, but related, because this is the birthday of Lawrence Hammond, the man who invented the Hammond organ. And you would generally assume that someone who invents an organ would be an accomplished musician. But in Hammond's case, he was an all purpose inventor. He worked on some of the earliest automatic transmissions at the turn of the 20th century. He worked on building things like clocks and barometers. He made something called a teleview, which I guess you could call it sort of um, an early form of not television, but a kind of 3D projection device. Not projection device, but kind of like a predecessor to the 3D glasses, where you would hold something up in front of you while an image from film is being projected on a screen, and it would show it in 3D. So he was a really inventive guy. But the invention that he's most famous for was his 1935 invention, or 34 rather, of the tone wheel organ, the Hammond organ. And this changed music. I mean, you can look at Gibson and their early electric guitars. You can look 20 years after that and Leo Fender and his electric guitars. You can look at what the Rhodes Corporation was doing with pianos, and then in the 50s when they teamed up with Fender to make the Fender Rhodes. But with all of those things, one of the most important instruments that defined every single genre of 20th century music, and an instrument that is still played and beloved right up to the 21st century, it is the Hammond organ. It's hard to think of another instrument that has been so pervasive across so many genres. You can look at it as an instrument that is prominent in sacred music, in church music. It's an instrument that can be used to play classical organ pieces in lieu of a pipe organ. It's all over jazz of every genre, every style of blues, every style of rock. It appears in hip hop, it appears in funk and soul, it appears in folk music, it appears in country and western music. I struggle to think of it appears in Afrobeat music. I struggle to think of any major genre of the 20th century. I'm sure there are a few, but it's an instrument that has appeared in more genres than it hasn't. And you could make a strong case that it is one of the most important individual instruments of the 20th century. And even though the electric guitar is sort of the instrumental lingua franca of pop music of the second half of the 20th century, you could say that with the Hammond organ, it's even more unique, because a single guitarist might have several different guitars that he or she is fond of, depending on what style of music, depending on what song they are playing. Maybe there's someone who wants a Telecaster for one song, a Gibson Les Paul for another, a Vox for another. But when it comes to the Hammond organ, a lot of musicians just buy a Hammond and they keep their Hammond for life and play it on just about everything. And so that's why I think there is that very strong case that one of these great innovative inventors. And I wish we had more men like this, people like Lorenz Hammond. It was just one of many, many, many inventions, but it changed not only the way that music was perceived, but it changed the very sound of music because of its ubiquity and because its sort of minor sonic imperfections actually helped create a style of art around it because it sounded so good. It's like what Hemingway said. Sometimes the truth just has a certain ring to it. And in the case of Hammond organs, there is a certain sound that is instantly recognizable, no matter which drawbars are in or out, whether you have the tremolo on or off. You know it's a Hammond when you're hearing it, even when you put it through an effects processor, like, for example, Tony Banks did through much of his career in Genesis. So, happy posthumous birthday to Lorenz Hammond. He was born in 1895 in Evanston, Illinois, died at the age of 78 in Cornwall, Connecticut. So, a very interesting life and one that many musicians owe much to. Um, Speaking of deaths, there was a sad death that occurred yesterday, and this was that of Sam Moore, one half of Sam and Dave. Now, Sam and Dave are one of the great vocal duos of all time. And if you want any evidence of this, look at their performance from the early 70s on the Midnight Special. It's one of many that the Midnight Special's production crew, Burt Sugarman and all of his gang, have put onto YouTube. They do something that I mentioned before, but I really love it. Every Friday, they put a full episode on. They do every episode in sequence from the pilot up to the last one. I think we're in the year 1974 now, so we've got a few more years to go before we've sort of exhausted all of that they have to offer. But they did an episode with Sam and Dave, and they've clipped the Sam and Dave performances, so you can look those up, and they are really good. They are such dynamic singers, no cracking, no just perfect voices, as good live, arguably better than on the record, and of course they are backed by the Stax crew, members of Booker T and the MGs, including Donald Duck Dunn, who's playing his bass with a wonderful briar pipe sticking out of his mouth, and of course the wonderful guitarist Steve Cropper. Sam and Dave also have a relationship to Isaac Hayes because prior to his superstardom as a solo artist, composer, and arranger, he was writing songs and doing arrangements for some of the biggest stars on Stax Records, including Sam and Dave. And some of their most famous songs, including Hold On, I'm Coming and Soul Man, were in fact written by or co-written by Isaac Hayes. So we've got all sorts of superstar connections there. Now, Dave Porter, the other half of Sam and Dave, died in the 80s, or Dave Prater, rather. Porter was one of the songwriters, but Sam had been keeping on, and he had been performing right up until fairly recent years. He had a surgery recently and died at the age of 89 in his native Florida. So rest in peace to Sam Moore, one of the absolute great vocalists of all time. Getting back to the issue of natural disasters and music, I think of a song that was written by Randy Newman, but in a sort of vintage throwback style. It was written in 74, but it doesn't sound like a song from the 70s per se. And this was a song called Louisiana 1927 about a terrible flood in the Delta that happened at that time. And one of my favorite versions is that of Aaron Neville. He's from Louisiana, obviously. He has that unique voice, and it's the opening track to one of his finest solo albums. Such great arrangements. And this is 1991's Warm Your Heart. You should definitely listen to that to see when done right, music can really capture the ethos and the pathos that surrounds a natural disaster. Um, and that leads me to something that, again, the internet has made possible, which is a live musical reaction to a natural disaster as it's ongoing. Now, I've talked on this channel before about Nate Dogg, the first sort of hook singer of West Coast hip hop. Really, really a talent, a man whose voice just makes every track better. He sadly died in 2011 due to complications from strokes. But in the 90s and early 2000s, he was sort of the singing voice that sort of made West Coast hip hop even better than it already was. He collaborated with all the greats: Warren G, a frequent collaborator, Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, name it, anyone and everyone on the West Coast, and even collaborated with non-West Coast artists, people like Ludacris and others. So Nate Dogg, one of my favorites. Now, one of his sons is very much involved in the music industry. This is Nail, Nhale, and he recorded a song with an accompanying music video called City on Fire, literally about LA on fire. And he's out there. You can see it on his Instagram, and it's gone viral on other platforms too. Sort of recording the music video next to a burnt out building. And the refrain is, of course, City on Fire, but I'm still smoking. I think it's really an interesting artistic statement because obviously Randy Newman's Louisiana 1927 was written in 1974. About an event that happened before Randy Newman was born. That's the analog world. You couldn't really come out with a song on record in the midst of a natural disaster because the recording process wasn't as instantaneous. Mainly because of the distribution. You could obviously record a song in a day, but the distribution would have made things at least somewhat more difficult. You could have had a live satellite broadcast, but again, that would take some money behind you. Where Nail, with just someone probably holding up an iPhone, went out to one of the many burn sites around LA County. He did the music video just of him standing there, kept it simple, and it's out there and it's doing the rounds virally. Now, some people are saying, "Oh, he's making light of the situation." I don't really think so. Some are saying it's great, and again, like all things on social media, it's causing a big debate. But I personally like it. I think it's got a good beat. I think it's got some very interesting lyrics, in fact, and I think that. If it's perfectly acceptable to talk in music, to communicate in music about a natural disaster decades after it's happened, I think that it's actually that much more direct and cathartic to talk about it while it's going on. Because what is life if we cannot create, if we cannot make art, if we cannot make music? And of course, every different genre is going to be someone else's, cup of tea. But the fact that he went out there to make an artistic statement in the middle of everything, I think is a very bold and interesting artistic move. And I think there's another important point. Once the smoke literally and metaphorically clears from a natural disaster like a fire, there's a tendency among the elite forces of political power, of academic power, and of mass media power to lie about past events, to rewrite narratives, to create a sort of Stockholm syndrome, gaslighting, they sometimes call it, where we remember the narrative rather than the event that we might have directly witnessed. By making this song out in the middle of the rubble, I think Nail has done the world a service because there are no filters, so to speak. This person isn't from the news media or any other propagandistic outfit. He's not a politician. He's not an academic who are, paid to say certain things. He's someone who's just out there. He wrote some lyrics quickly, obviously, and he's out there speaking, rapping what is on his mind, and doing an artistic statement that I think is really powerful. Because if people want to know what it looked like, what people were thinking from the arts, how the reactions that the media tends to portray as binary are in reality very much more diverse. It's interesting. The media claims to love diversity. They don't. They hate it because the only diversity that really actually matters is the diversity of ideas, the diversity of creativity, the diversity of thought and of opinions and of the means of expressing those opinions. They hate that. For that, they want everything to be sort of in ones and zeros, A or B, black and white, AC or DC. But I think what Nail did in doing this music video out in the fire or the smoldering remains of the fire is actually something that is very cathartic. And I just really respect him for doing that. People have different opinions. They obviously have the right to those opinions, but I think what he did was really, really interesting. And I hope more musicians, more artists feel that internal compulsion to actually go out there and make an artistic statement about the things that they have witnessed, about what it made them feel, about the loss, about other things. I mean, kudos to Mel Gibson from another genre of the arts, not music but acting. He, as a very witty person, had an interesting thing to say. He lost his home, and he said, "Well, look at the bright side. I don't have to worry about all those pesky plumber problems." And I just love that, because if you can remain stoic, or even with gallows style humor when something really objectively bad has happened, I think that it makes the inevitability of the aftermath of loss less painful. Obviously, if you're Mel Gibson, you have the financial resources to make it less painful too. But stoicism is helpful even when we're not in such positions. Of course, the best thing would have been for it to never happen, but for that, we'd have to point our fingers at politicians. And I know Mark Zuckerberg said that we can now do so on Meta. I'm not sure what Google owned YouTube has to say about that. Time will tell. If my account is suddenly burned off the face of the internet, you'll know why. And it certainly isn't the hand of God, it's the hand of man, as it is in so many other disasters that we are witnessing. But those are my thoughts on some different issues that have come up today. As always, let me know what you think in the comments section. And as always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.